Hello and welcome to Political Thinking, a conversation with, rather than an interrogation of, someone who shapes our political thinking about what has shaped theirs. Every so often, there's an issue that bubbles up, if you'll forgive the metaphor, and reaches beyond the Westminster bubble. The issue we're talking about today is the issue of sewage, the quality of our waterways, our rivers and our seas. And my guest this week on Political Thinking is the man who's ensured that no political figure can ignore that question of the quality of our waterways. He is keen angler, campaigner and original lead singer with the Undertones, Feargal Sharkey, a man who left the stage in order to campaign for musicians' rights before taking up his current position as one of the country's leading environmental campaigners. He began life in the Bogside in Derry, as we'll hear. He is now a hero to people from the Green Party to the readers of the Daily Telegraph, the Countryside Alliance to surfers against sewage. Feargal Sharkey, welcome to Political Thinking.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, you have been described, I saw, as a stroppy former punk rocker who won't take no for an answer. Do you plead guilty?
Am I right in thinking that might have been a man called Michael Duggar? And I think I'm seeing him in a few days' time. I'm going to have to remonstrate with him over that.
Former Labour MP.
Former Labour MP.
Former head of the music industry.
Indeed. Do I take no for an answer? No. I've never been very good at that. Stroppy, well, I'll discuss that with Michael further. We can expand on that one. I would deny the former charge and probably have to concede the latter one.
What about former punk rocker? Do you think of yourself as a punk? Because Undertones clearly came in that era. But I looked at a video of you the other day. There you were, not with the kind of spiky hair, not with the safety pins. You were there with a smart jacket and a white shirt, not that different from you today.
Listen, it was a moment in time. Were there things called punk rock in Derry? Probably not. Were we at the time developing a young band and 5 kids putting a band together that shared a lot of the same ethos and ideals? Absolutely, without question. But we were very clear about it. We were just trying to make great 3-minute pop songs.
What about the punk bit of it? Because, yeah, you said it was an era, but if it was anything, it was anti-establishment. It was an ability to say there's something wrong with the way things are organised.
For me, not necessarily anti-establishment. It's anti what's going on is not working. And for those of us that are old enough, bearing in mind the mid-1970s, if the United Kingdom was ever ripe for revolution, then it was the mid-1970s. Now, in Northern Ireland and in Derry, we had kind of a decade head start by that point for other reasons. But people here will remember mountains of rubbish being disposed of and collected and held in Leicester Square. There was 3-day working weeks. There was electricity supply being rationed. And I think it was just simply young people rebelling about what they were about to inherit and the state of the nation that they were be gifted by the adults and people in control at the time.
Now, in 100 ways, we're a long way from that. But there was a poll recently showing that a vast number of people think things simply don't work in this country. And it seems to me, and we'll talk specifically about water in a second, that maybe that's what this has, forgive the pun, tapped into, a sense of things aren't good enough.
Oh, I personally have no doubt about that at all. There's an enormous sense of rage and anger and frustration out there, right across the board. And it's not a party political broadcast, but we have created a nation where nurses are having to sit and make a choice at night between whether or not the children get fed or the heating gets kept on. This is a G7 member state, one of the leading national countries on the planet, one of the most open market-based economies, and we've created that kind of situation. Well, as the saying goes, a plague of locusts on all of our houses for ever having allowed that to happen. So is the sewage campaign being used by some people to express that frustration and anger and outrage? Absolutely, because it has become a symptom of a much greater disease and malaise that this nation's suffering from.
Well, we'll talk about that background in Derry and the influence it had on you in a minute or two. But first of all, why sewage? Why water? Why of all the things that you might be passionate about and campaign?
There I was, minding my own business.
It's the love of fishing that begins it.
Oh, it is. The school that I went to, Christian Brothers in Derry, was founded in a very simple ethos. When that school was established in the Bogside, over 100 years ago now, the local community was made up of one-room houses with dirt floors and sometimes not one but 2 and 3 families living in one room. So the whole ethos of the school was, we don't have the resource and the means to provide these people with charity. But what we can do is educate the kids. Amongst other things, we were presented with a very long list of after-school clubs and societies, and you were required to volunteer for 6.
And one of those 6 was angling.
Funnily enough, it was 2 boxes. One marked fly fishing, the other marked fly tying.
Right. So, okay, fishing.
Yeah.
There'll be people listening, there's people watch you say, I don't get it. What's a grown man doing there standing there with a stick? What is it?
Here's the thing. As Isaac Walton himself said, is it not an art to deceive a trout with a fly? A trout. I have always had one of those minds that I've got 10,000 different things rattling about in the back of my mind all day long, every day. I find it quite a challenging occasion just to back off and relax. And fly fishing is one of those things that I have to concentrate on. Because bearing in mind what you're actually doing is trying to deceive this beautiful wild fish, a trout, that this thing that you've assembled using bits of feather and fur and silk actually resembles a real live genuine insect.
You not just enthuse about fishing, but you become and still are the chair of the oldest angling club in England.
Yeah.
And it's there that you see what's happening to the water.
As part of my handover, and I had been aware of it, standing this river, we were losing water. To the extent that the river was stagnating. Now we're talking about 2.5 miles of chalk stream in Hertfordshire. This is one of the rarest river systems on the planet, and we're treating it with that level of contempt. Now I went and, as part of the handover, had a number of conversations with the Environment Agency and rapidly became aware that this was an issue that people had known about for the better part of 15 years. They'd known what was causing it, they'd known what the solution was, but did little, if anything, to act upon it to such an extent that this river was dying.
And you took legal action. You took judicial review.
We didn't quite get to the High Court, but I was standing on the door, banging furiously on the door, ringing the doorbell, demanding entry. And thankfully at the last minute, as I normally refer to it, Nick, the grown-ups were let into the room.
And did you at that moment think, this is a beginning of a new phase in my life?
No,
This is the beginning of a great campaign? Or were you just trying to get that bit of river?
That was it. That's all I was interested in. What it did, however, that experience... There's only 60 members of the Alma Magna. There's only ever been 60 members. And it kind of pricked my curiosity. And as I now explain it, foolishly, stupidly, naively, I scratched that itch. And every day I scratch it, I just end up with an even bigger itch.
There's another puzzle for people looking at you, which is why it took you to get those 60 men and women to march. Now, does that then take us all the way back to your upbringing in Derry, your mum and dad marching, that you grew up in the place where the civil rights marches in Northern Ireland in the 60s really began?
This is when we all start getting very Freudian.
Is that where it began, though? Your knowledge of the need to campaign, the possibility of change?
I know it's an old adage. Yes, it is very Freudian. And in my particular case, yes, you can blame the parents. My father was the chairman of the Labour Party in Derry in the early 1960s, when there was such a thing. Branch secretary of his local union, the Electricians Union. I can vividly remember him pulling out a beaten-up, faded old copy of the Morning Star, where he appeared in a generic photograph on the front page of delegates leaving the TUC conference, Blackpool Winter Gardens, 1963. When my father passed away, there was a Irish Times ran an obituary and highlighted how he had spent a lot of the 50s trying to reach out, because clearly we were Catholics coming from Derry, trying to reach out to the Protestant working classes and Protestant workers on the basis that he was utterly convinced that the industrialists in Northern Ireland were using the axe and hatchet of sectarianism to divide the working classes and to exploit them.
Crudely, he didn't think this was, in essence, a battle between religious groupings.
Not at all.
He thought it was a class battle.
Completely, and he was in reality a socialist trying to unite and combine the greater power and influence of the working classes to do a good deal with the industrialists.
And yet, as a boy growing up in Catholic Derry,
Yeah.
in nationalist Derry,
Yeah.
in Republican
Yeah.
Derry, at the moment that the IRA was not born, but reborn, if you like,
Yeah.
as an active terrorist organisation, you could not be political, could you? I mean, you have to be dragged into that.
Well, you see, the thing is, I've just said all that about my father, but my father actually wasn't the politician in the house. My father wasn't the one who was the campaigner and the driver of events. That was my mother. I'm more comfortable talking about this in the modern world. Feargal is actually my second name. My first name is Shan. I'm named Shan South and Feargal O'Hanlon after two dead IRA men killed while attacking a police station in Northern Ireland in 1957. What might that tell you about my mum's politics? And it was my mum on the morning of the 9th of April 1969 bundled everybody into the family car and demanded Dad drove us to the other side of Ireland, where as a family we took part in the People's Democracy civil rights march between Belfast and Dublin, protesting and highlighting injustices in Northern Ireland.
One of the defining events of
absolutely.
the period that led to what
Yeah.
we now call, euphemistically, absurdly in many ways,
Yeah.
the Troubles.
Yeah, so I'm 10 years old.
Yeah.
And I find myself in the middle of this People's Democracy March, walking down the middle of the main road between Belfast and Dublin, waving very enthusiastically, I have to say. What I later would begin to discover was commonly referred to as an anarchist flag. But you're 10 years old. This is fantastic. It's a day out.
You say you're comfortable talking now. So much has changed. We've
Yeah.
just marked, some have celebrated, not all,
Yeah.
the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. In those days, to admit you were named after an IRA man would lead to rage, hatred.
Oh, listen, there's the truth is, in those days, you were very careful, and this applied to both communities. You would be very careful and very judicial about where you went at night after dark and which parts of town you were prepared to enter and which you were not and which you would avoid. Because simply for that fact, you could end up in an awful lot of trouble. The kind of shorthand version at the time, in the 1960s and 70s, both ironically enough, highlighting the injustice of the place, you would be asked the simple question, what school did you go to?
And that was your label.
Well, as a teenager, that depended on whether or not you were about to be beaten up. But as an adult, it also dictated whether or not you were about to be offered that job you thought you were going to get. By that simple answer would dictate and tell and expose whether or not you were Catholic or Protestant.
And whether you had a future or not.
And whether or not you had a future. And at the time in Derry, I think it was about 60% of men in Derry were unemployed. And the vast majority of those, 99% of them, were Catholic.
So you grow up with this injustice,
Yeah.
with this passionate and political family. What did they teach you, Mum and Dad, you said it was Freudian, about the politics you do now, in which, and we'll come to discuss this in the current context, you're 1 minute having an alliance with the Labour Party, the next time it's with the Duke of Wellington. You are forming cross-party, cross-view alliances.
It goes back to my father. Some people might say that he was being brilliantly insightful, some possibly saying foolish, trying to reach out to the Protestant working classes and go, all of us as a class are being exploited by industrialists and we need to cut out this sectarianism and the things that divide us, because as a group we will be better, stronger and bigger and more capable of dictating and controlling the future for the working classes in Northern Ireland.
But did they also make you believe that change was possible? Because plenty of people growing up in that sort of politics, that sort of disadvantage, might just think, forget it. Life is never going to work for me.
Well, it instilled in me two things. And again, my mother was the driver in all of this. It became almost a demand of us. Well, I think three things. One, if you saw a social injustice, you had an obligation to confront it and deal with it. Secondly, I was brought up in a world where I sat in a kitchen where the housewife, the plumber, the electrician, the unemployed, the school teacher debated and discussed and planned civil disobedience and rebellion. And I watched firsthand as a 12-year-old the school teacher, the housewife, the bricklayer, the electrician, the unemployed bring down the national government in Northern Ireland, or play quite a substantial part in bringing about the destruction of the government in Northern Ireland. So the house I grew up in, anything was possible. And the third was possibly the most biggest element of all. I was entitled to have an opinion, and I could have pretty much any opinion I wanted, but I needed to be intellectually to justify it.
Now, you were clear that in a way this is a conversation you can now have because people have moved on. On this podcast, I've spoken to most of the leaders of politics in Northern Ireland in recent years, and all of them deeply, deeply scarred.
Yes.
Either actually blown up, shot, all their relatives were. It forms a part of who they were. I think people listening to you who don't know your story may nevertheless be surprised because they remember the Undertones as a non-political band, a band who really didn't sing about that. He sang about girls and life and happiness.
Listen, absolutely, and I'm not trying to over-dramatise this. If you went into the centre, well, you didn't have to go into the centre of town. Frequently, I couldn't even walk out my front door within minutes finding myself spread-eagled on my fingertips with my legs being kicked back, being searched and questioned and everything else. But by the way, that was not some injustice being perpetrated on me as an individual. If you were a male teenager living in Derry, frequent the places I did, the Bogside, the Cregan, that was just a fact of life.
There was only one moment that I can see in which the Undertones did embrace, might not be the right word, but reflect politics. You were on Top of the Pops the night Bobby Sands,
somebody has done their research,
the hunger striker, died. I mean, for those of us of a certain age, and particularly for those of you from Northern Ireland, this was an extraordinarily profound moment. An IRA man in prison who starves himself to death to make a political point. Margaret Thatcher's government in a rage about it. Impotent, though, because you always are in the case of a hunger strike. And plenty of people who are not supporters of terrorism or violence or the IRA who had some sympathy for what Sands had done.
Listen, the truth is, yes, to the original question, people in Derry, and particularly young men, lived and breathed that all day, every day. So when we were kind of playing in the Casbah, little local pub that gave us a residency, the last thing the 40 or 50 people, our peers, 17, 18, 19 years old, the last thing they needed on a Friday night was us lecturing them about politics and injustice. Outside the Casbah, there was a British Army checkpoint, so all they had to do was step out the door. But when it came to that particular event, here is a man, a citizen of the United Kingdom, that has just starved himself to death and been overseen, and that situation created and driven by the state that allowed that to happen. Well, at that point, you've broken everybody's resolve, and now everybody has to stand up. And if that meant wearing black armbands on Top of the Pops, well, so be it.
And it's going to happen. A tune I know well, but I had no idea it was to do with hunger strikes, had a message.
Yes, and that's basically then people it came up on the Once Upon a Lifetime in Northern Ireland. Clearly it covered Bloody Sunday. And yes, the story was told there, and it was true because I was on the ground at the time. That single event, the following day, that swelled the ranks of the IRA by untold multiples, because people simply would not be prepared to accept that kind of act of violence by the state against its own citizens.
So it is quite a journey from there to this alliance with the Duke of Wellington. Now, long before you did the water campaign, long before you did the sewage campaign, you've alluded to, as well as being a music professional, you're a campaigner for the rights of musicians.
Yeah.
And you'd moved here. You said that you didn't want your little boy to have the same sort of upbringing as you.
Correct.
How easy was it for you, though, to operate in the British establishment? Because that's what you had to do to live a little change in the music industry now in water, with the sort of background and with the sort of values you've been brought up with.
Oh, no, you see, because that's, hopefully I've highlighted here. Yes, some of those values were about being very focused on what you want to achieve, being very clear intellectually on how you can go and achieve it, being incredibly empathetic to the people that you're talking to, and understanding their point of view and their challenges and their objectives, and trying to explore and find that commonality in that middle ground, being able to express it, narrate it. and ultimately being able to create that kind of argument where people will see the justification and the right behind the point you're trying to make and be prepared to follow up and commit themselves to achieving the same goal. Well, that's called politics. I didn't know that at the time, but that is what I believe is politics. And the inference you made, and I did say it to him, and he fell on the floor roaring in laughter a little while back. I was having a conversation with the Duke of Wellington, and it did occur to me, and I did say to him, listen, I've just had this thought. This government is so utterly hopeless. They've actually managed to put the son of a Republican Irish family and the Duke of Wellington on the same side of an argument. That's a genius move. Utterly brilliant. Well done.
And that was the alliance that produced some change in the regulation of the water companies and maybe led up to this moment that we had the other day in which the water companies issue this apology and promise to spend 10 billion. Now, I spoke to you on the Today programme that morning thinking you'd be very political. Go, well, look, no, we welcome the apology as far as it goes, but and you blew it up. Maybe this is what that thing about being a punk campaigner made. You basically said you didn't really believe a word of it.
Correct.
They should give the 10 billion back to ordinary people.
Well, as we now know, it's less than, in fact, today, it's a week ago today that they made that apology. And as it turns out, it didn't even take a week before United Utilities, Severn Trent Water, two of the biggest sewage dumpers in the country, have now announced in the last 48 hours they are going to pay £550 million in dividends to their shareholders over the next couple of weeks. So they weren't that bloody sorry, were they?
Well, they say, no, look, if you don't pay dividends, you don't get shareholders. You don't have shareholders, you don't get investment. If you don't get investment, you don't have smarter sewers.
Here's the thing. Water companies don't invest anything. Any money that goes into the system comes out of our pockets. And for me, I thought it was the most incredible lack of foresight and planning and management and leadership within the industry to put that statement out. Because take out the apology bit, which was a non-apology. You must know at this point the level of anger, frustration and rage amongst your customers at what you've done over the last 30 years.
And yet you see...
outrageous.
Someone who, I'm afraid, in the rules of this business has to stay anonymous, who's worked with you on these issues in the past, said he's got silly now. He must know that you can't possibly give £10 billion back to the customers. The money's gone.
The point I was trying to illustrate by bringing that up is a very simple one. And this was a regulator, in my opinion, just trying to cover their own rear end. Ofwat wrote to the water companies a year and a half ago, reminding them of their statutory obligations, that they have a binding legal obligation to build, operate, maintain sewage systems, and I am now quoting, capable of effectively dealing with the contents of those sewers. So you have a legal obligation to do it. The regulator's saying that you've had all the funding to comply with that obligation. Water companies have to certify annually that they've got all the funding they needed. Well, you clearly haven't spent it in the sewage system, so where's our money gone?
The people listening to this will say, why limit Feargal Sharkey to water? You've done music, you've done water. Politics. Surely. It's in the blood. You've just told us you know how to do it.
Nick, here's the thing. I, as a musician, was gifted the most beautiful, wonderful, glorious thing. For decades of my adult life, all of my adult life, random people have walked up to me up in the street, all over the world, and simply wanted to introduce themselves and talk about music. Now, what a glorious thing to happen about records people bought, gigs they'd been to. Over the last 2 or 3 years, that has evolved onto a whole other level. They now want me to talk about effluent in rivers. Well, here's the thing. I'd be really happy to go back to talking about music as quickly and as efficiently as possible. I genuinely have no ambition to go and stand for Parliament and all that kind of stuff. I genuinely, that's somebody else's job, more suited than I am.
Which is very good news, because you could be Lord Sharkey of Amwell.
Oh, no, stop that. That's just,
That'd be the great thing for the Republican boy from Derry, wouldn't it?
But there would be a story to tell. How a little boy called Shan Feargal became Lord Sharkey of Amwell.
Then you could have lunch in the House of Lords dining room with the Duke of Wellington every day.
Stop it.
That's a non-denial. Feargal Sharkey, thanks very much indeed for joining me on Political Thinking.
Nick, thank you for the opportunity. Hugely appreciated.
Now, whether or not Feargal becomes Lord Sharkey, and I got the sense I wonder if you did, that he really wouldn't mind. He's got a lot to teach people about how to bring about change, being prepared to work with people you disagree with as well as those you agree with. Always being willing to be personable and realising that to win at any campaign, you have to know your facts. You have to be intelligent. You have to be capable of debating. But above all, communicating a passion about a subject many other people may barely have given a moment's thought to, in a way that makes them want to be part of your cause. Thanks for watching.